Thank you for joining another Microsoft Graph developer community call. I'm actually here in the room with Darrel. Darrel's in town for the week from Montreal. He's brought the ice weather with him. Thank you for that. So today, this is going to be a bit different from some of the other community calls that we've done in the past. We really are encouraging feedback with these sessions. And we've got two topics that are strongly aligned around SDKs, which is Darrel's world within Microsoft Graph. So you'll be hearing mostly from Darrel in this session. Firstly, we're making some decisions around what we're going to be doing with authentication around the SDKs. And then we really want to dive deep on the Fluent JS SDKs based on some feedback and discussions we've been having with lots of people in the community over the last few months. So I'm Jeremy. Darrel, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, hi. I am the PM for the SDKs and a variety of other developer tooling to help make it easier to access the Microsoft Graph.
Awesome. And you probably, if you're not following us on Twitter and you're on Twitter's, I'd highly recommend following us. We do share a lot of different things around the graph over the periods of days in between all the different other channels that we engage with you on. So without further ado, Darrel, hand it straight over to you to talk a bit more about the Azure SDKs.
Yes, and as Jeremy said, there's a bit of a theme in the sessions today, and it's a lot about trying to find ways that we can reuse existing efforts and so that we can deliver more value without Microsoft and community duplicating efforts, but also without moving your cheese, because we all know that folks have investments in stuff, and when we take stuff away, it doesn't really help anybody. So without further ado, why are we doing this? There's a few motivations with regard specifically to us aligning with the Azure SDKs. One of them being we've had a request from the developer division, who are the team that actually own the creation of the Azure SDKs. They want to align with Graph specifically because they're seeing more and more scenarios where there's crossover between people who are developing on the Graph and people who are working with Azure resources. And considering when it comes to using SDKs, basically under the covers, really, you're just making an HTTP call. So why should it really be different? We also, if you follow the work that we're doing, we have a growing backlog of stuff, and people keep suggesting awesome ideas, and we don't quite have enough people to be able to do all of the things that need to get done. So having some additional help, being able to reuse existing assets from the Azure team is just bonus for everyone. Also, the thing is, we have to learn what is the best way of setting up an environment in order for people to be able to make calls reliably, efficiently, be able to get good tracing, observability, reliability. And we've got two different teams sort of doing the same thing. It's good for us to be able to learn from each other. And hopefully the end result is it's best for you folks. So what are we trying to do? Well, first, reduce cost friction from customers who are using both the Graph and Azure. Leverage the work that has already been done by the Azure SDK team. And you'll see as we go in through this, some of it is just simply aligning on guidelines. I like to use the phrase, choosing the color of the bike shed. In some cases, we've chosen one color and they've chosen another color, and that's just unnecessary friction. And the end result is we have to build a better experience for Graph customers. And we do recognize that in the Azure world, sometimes things are done a little bit differently. And sometimes there are reasons for the fact that Graph does things differently than Azure. And therefore, where it does make sense to take a different approach, we will continue to do what is best for the Graph customers. We're not just going to go, oh, yeah, let's just take the Azure stuff and make everybody in Graph use that. And even though it doesn't quite fit, we'll just save ourselves the trouble. No, the end result is to produce a better experience. So before I continue, I just want to give a kind of overview of how the SDKs are currently built and how all the pieces come together, and sort of compare and contrast between how we do it over in the Graph world versus how it happens in the Azure world. And it will kind of set the scene for us talking about the alignment work and areas where we're not going to align. So here we go. The way it works in Graph is all the teams who build services on the Graph come along, they describe their APIs using CSDL. So each service team has CSDL. So CSDL is conceptual schema description language, basically a big chunk of XML that describes what an OData API looks like. If you've ever worked in using Entity Framework and done EDM models, it's basically the same thing as EDM. And then the metadata for each of those services is aggregated together and then exposed in a public endpoint on the Graph, what we call a $metadata endpoint. And you can query that for both the V1 API and the Beta API to see all the description of the Graph API. And we use that metadata for all kinds of purposes, and we're using it for more and more over time. So what do we do with the metadata? Well, we feed it into a tool called Typewriter, which is kind of just like a wrapper tool. It's a command line tool we built. And all of these tools that I'm talking about all live in GitHub, open sourced, under the Microsoft Graph repository. Unfortunately, Typewriter lives under a repo name that's called something like MS Graph SDK Generator. So we take that Typewriter tool, and we use the Viper library, which is another older Microsoft library for doing code gen using T4 templates. And we take a set of T4 templates for the different languages that we support, and we output a set of libraries. Now, before we actually do the processing, I did this a little out of order here, also use a tool called API Doctor to scrape a bunch of documentation information from the online docs, because again, those are open sourced on GitHub in the Microsoft Graph repo. And we pull that and we enhance the metadata with that documentation, which is why when you use the C# libraries, you actually get IntelliSense appearing, telling you what the names of various properties are. And that text is extracted directly from the docs pages. So Typewriter then emits a set of what we call service libraries. Currently, we're emitting 2 different service libraries, a service library for the V1 API, and also in some languages, we do it also for the Beta service language. So for each of the languages we support, we produce a service library. And those service libraries sit on top of 2 other handcrafted artisanal libraries, the core and the auth library. They provide all of our standard cross-cutting concerns. And it's really those core libraries where we have some opportunity for reuse and work. Also, the auth library is something new that we introduced last year. And as of yet, it's still sitting in preview. We've had a lot of community feedback that people were like, could we get this to GA already? And we're like, yes, we want to get it to GA so that people can use it because there's many companies that will not use preview stuff. There's people building samples that don't want to use preview stuff. There's been some versioning issues because the MSAL library that we use under the covers has a higher version need for a .NET standard. We've been waiting for some of the other languages, like we were waiting for the MSAL for Java to be released. So there's been some delays in getting that that auth library GA'd. But we have a slight change of plans, and we'll get to that in a moment, and we would love your feedback on that. So this is kind of how it works today for most of our SDKs, but we've actually started to take a slightly different path for our most recent SDK that we're previewing, which is the PowerShell library. Now, the PowerShell library, the way it exposes its APIs is quite a bit different than the other SDKs. And we also here took our first steps towards leveraging some of the work that the Autorest team did. So here's the slightly different approach. Well, okay, I got a little ahead of myself here. The problem with using Autorest is that it doesn't take CSDL as an input. It takes OpenAPI as an input. And that's not how we describe Graph. So in order to make that happen, we first have to create an OpenAPI description of the Graph. And we've done that by creating this DevX API that provides a service for generating Open API descriptions from the CSDL. And that same DevX API actually powers a bunch of other experiences. It powers our new Graph Explorer with the new permissions thing and the samples and the code generation that's in there. And the code generation is also used by API Doctor in order to generate the samples, the snippets that you now see in the reference documentation. And so we generate that Open API description, and we feed it into AutoRest. We did have a little challenge in that the CSDL for Graph is rather large, and when you convert it into Open API descriptions, it's not large, it's massive. And AutoRest was a little upset at us providing it with that large of an Open API description, which is, if you've played with the Microsoft Graph PowerShell library, is why when you download it, it downloads 90 different modules, because we had to split the API down into smaller chunks for AutoRest to be able to consume it. But it works, and we have that preview of Microsoft Graph PowerShell out on the PowerShell gallery today. Now you'll see that that Microsoft Graph PowerShell library layers on top of our .NET Core and .NET Auth libraries to provide the core graph calling capabilities, and the rest of it is the generated code. So this is our first foray into using AutoRest, and the next major piece that we're looking into doing is actually using another generator that the AutoRest team are building, which is for CLIs. And so our goal is to produce a Microsoft Graph CLI using the same Open API description as an input, and that will generate Microsoft's Graph CLI. However, this will not sit on top of .NET Core and .NET Auth. It will sit on top of the Python core. Now, those of you who are familiar with our offerings at the moment might be saying, but wait, you don't have a Python core SDK at the moment. That's right. That is part of our roadmap for delivering the CLI, is to produce a Python core and Python Auth libraries to power the Microsoft Graph CLI. One of the reasons that they are using Python is that if you've ever used the AZ CLI, they have a notion of being able to query the JSON responses that come back with JamesPath, which is a Python library. And also the CLI not only provides a command line tool, the generator has the ability to generate what are called magic modules, which can then be used to generate Terraform and Ansible modules. So if the plan goes through, we will have a wide range of support for the many different pieces, infrastructure tools that people use for provisioning infrastructure. And the story should be identical whether you're provisioning to Azure or provisioning to the Graph. So that's sort of where we are today and where we are going in the short to medium term. I want to contrast that a little bit with the way Azure works. And before I go on, are there any questions?
No, I was waiting to get to a good point to say, essentially, if you have questions, because there are nearly 170 in the call, if you can put them into the chat, I will then find a good time where Darrel takes a breath to ask him a question.
And some coffee.
And some coffee. So yeah, I will keep an eye. There's been none in there so far.
Cool. So Azure themselves, their SDK team, are going through a bit of a transition too in the way that they are building SDKs. And so what I'm doing now is describing their new model. And there are a number of their APIs that are supporting the new model. As a consumer of the SDKs, you probably won't notice. It's fairly seamless, their transition from the old model to the new, but it helps them provide a better experience over time. So the way that it works over at Azure Land is each of the 110 service teams, each creates by hand a JSON document that is an Open API description of their service. And they feed that Open API description into AutoRest, which has a set of generators, and that's supposed to say AutoRest.C#, but PowerPoint. There's too many Power products.
Need some more.
Chopped off some of my letters there. So they have a set of generators because Autorest is a pluggable model to do a whole bunch of generation. And they output for each language and each service a deployed package, which is a set of generated code and a client for that particular service. And it sits on top of Azure Core and Azure Identity, which are their equivalent to our Graph Core and Graph Auth. The big difference really is that in Azure, they create a separate deployed package for every single service. And those packages are versioned independently because the underlying APIs are versioned independently also. Whereas Graph, we version the entire Graph API together, so all services are versioned together. And as of to date, we really only have the Beta API and the V1 API. So really, there's only those two different versions out there. The Azure services, some of them version once every 6 months, sometimes, once a year type of thing. So when you combine that with the 110 services, there's a lot of packages out there, but it's just a slightly different deployment model. The interesting thing is that Azure Core and Azure Identity, because those libraries are doing a lot of the similar things to what we are doing in Azure Core, Graph Core and Graph Auth. And this is where we believe we can get some alignment that will bring some value. So one of the first things that we are considering is, and when I say considering, I mean considering very, very strongly, is taking our auth libraries that we have not yet GA'd and saying, let's not GA them, let's just adopt the Azure Identity. If you're familiar with the Graph Auth libraries, we have these things called authentication providers, and you configure the authentication provider with an MSAL application, and then pass that into the Graph service client, and we take care of acquiring tokens on your behalf. The Azure Identity works in a very similar way, but they have a notion called a token credential. And you create a token credential class based on your scenario, depending on whether you're doing username, password, or whether you're using a certificate, or whether you're using managed service identity, or whether you're using device code flow. You create a different token credential class, provide it with your credentials, and then you pass it into the service client. And then that token credential class takes care under the covers of actually going and getting the token when it's needed using the middleware pipeline. So architecturally, our two approaches are very, very similar. The difference being that we provide a different API for consumers of these two auth libraries to actually interact with these classes. So it would mean if you have an application that is calling both Graph APIs and Azure APIs, you would have to set up your security credentials two different ways and then use two different client libraries to call them. With this alignment, the idea is you would be able to create one token credential class and pass the same token credential class into both the Graph service client and whatever Azure service library you're currently using. This hopefully gives you as a consumer a better experience. It reduces the chances of, or it reduces the effort of our two teams implementing basically the same code. And this is becoming more and more the case now as Azure is moving to the AAD or the Azure AD Identity V2 endpoint. In the past, a lot of Azure still used the V1 endpoint, and people were still using ADAL. The Azure SDK team have made an effort to move everything over to using the V2 endpoint and MSAL where possible, which aligns with our approach on Graph. And The token credential classes is interesting because it's quite a simple model in that you know what credentials you provide. Do you have a client secret? Do you want to do a device code type? Also, you just pick exactly the scenario that you're interested based on the credentials that you want to provide. And by adopting the Azure Identity, we would end up getting support for scenarios like managed service identities, managed service identities, I believe, MSIs, because we haven't ever used the MSI acronym before at Microsoft. So that's where you could take a website and you could identify the website as having an identity and grant a role to that identity. We currently don't support that mechanism in Graph today, and the Azure Identity does, so we would win by that. The Azure Identity team also have an interesting concept that they call default credentials or default token credentials, which uses kind of a fallback mechanism where it goes and says, is there a managed identity that's going to give me credential? Nope. Okay, well, are there environment variables that are going to give me credentials? Oh, no. Okay, well, then I'll fall back to, is there something in the token cache that can give me a credential? Nope. Okay, fine. Then fall back all the way to, last but not least, actually doing an interactive experience. In Azure world, I think a lot of people use that default credential experience so that you can write code that will lift and shift and move into different environments, and it makes it easy to support in CI/CD scenarios. And of course, many eyes make bugs shallow. If we have the two teams, our team and their team, both looking over these identity auth scenarios for SDKs, we can hopefully produce a better quality product for you. And so that's where we are going with the identity side of things. The next item.
Sorry.
Yes.
There was a question here from Kirk Monroe. I'm currently working with Graph through PowerShell only, and as long as I can still use certificate-based authentication to connect to the Graph, continue to manage Graph resources in unattended scripts that leverage the CBA connection, it doesn't matter to me whether we use Microsoft Graph Auth or Azure Identity. So I guess the question is how does this impact PowerShell versus C# versus other things?
Then as we move to this model, it would bring to PowerShell the managed identity capabilities, which we've had requests for. It would bring this default credential potentially that allows you to pull secrets from environment variables. So if you are running CI/CD processes that have PowerShell scripts, you could use environment variables as part of that process. So it would be transparent.
Yeah.
And so I'm glad, Kirk, you said that you don't really care, because hopefully it would be transparent. It wouldn't change any of your scripts today. It would just bring additional features, and hopefully improve quality. Those are the two things that it would bring for the PowerShell developer.
Yeah, and then Paul Schaeflein brought up a good point around this notion of the most popular services, Cosmos DB, storage, etc., rely on keys instead of identity. So there are probably a lot of scenarios where people may not already be using Azure Identity in that instance.
Yeah, and I'm off the top of my head, I don't know, but I'm going to assume that the Azure SDK token credentials support going and getting a secret from Key Vault.
Right.
Because it would be kind of silly for the Azure team to build SDKs that don't go get it from Key Vault. And we just inherit that automatically.
Okay, and then David Lambert's feedback was, that's really appealing. Currently have an app with users ID'd in B2C and Azure AD, and it's not super easy to handle these consistently. So it'll be interesting to see that scenario.
We all hope that B2C scenarios are going to get easier.
Yeah, then there's a whole identity team that's like dedicated to the BTC scenarios, so I'm hoping that does improve in the future for sure.
And it helps the identity team too, because now the identity team are split insofar as supporting multiple different customers. Yeah. They're trying to support the needs of Azure, They're trying to support the needs of Graph, and we're going to go to them and go, yeah, well, we're basically the same customer now. We just have some additional scenarios, because at the moment, the Azure SDK token credentials don't have great support for web-based scenarios like auth code, flow, and on behalf of flow. So we will be contributing back additional token credential classes that allow those scenarios to be supported. They just weren't supported currently in the Azure SDKs because it just hasn't been their top priority, whereas it's much more of a common scenario in Graph.
Cool. So tell me, how do I adopt OpenTelemetry and logging, Darrel?
It's going to be just magic. So if you go to OpenTelemetry.io, it is becoming an industry standard. It was recently formed as a merge of two different teams, OpenCensus and OpenTracing, which was two different standards in the world because you can never have enough standards. They came together to make OpenTelemetry. It is, as I say, an industry standard way of doing distributed tracing, and it is vendor neutral. Microsoft are an active part, Google are actively involved, and they are writing a set of libraries that allow clients to collect data about calls that they're actually going to make, pass that information along the wire so that tracing systems like App Insights, like Dynatrace, like Stackdriver, like all the other major APMs, application performance monitoring tools, can ingest. And what's really cool about this is if you are prem with a big application that's using one set or one company to do your distributed tracing stuff, and then you call into Azure services, they're going to be able to bring all that data together and give you a single visualization of the trace calls that happen end to end, because everybody is using this industry standard. And I believe the goal is this to be part of what they call Azure Fundamentals. So this is a base piece of infrastructure that every service should support. And the Azure SDK team have already started work in adopting this into their SDKs. We were about to start doing it. We've done some investigations and proof of concepts into it, but by aligning with the Azure SDK team, we will be able to just pull their stuff in, and then you will be able to get visibility into how your apps are making calls and collect metrics on those calls that are happening. So that should just come for free. That's the theory. The next area, which probably will have less of an impact on consumers, other than the fact that we should do a better job of bringing to you consistent, reliable, regular updates, is we're just going to align engineering processes. The Azure SDK team spent quite a bit of time actually writing down their guidelines as to how they manage their source control and version identifiers and where they put packages and repositories. And we're just going to follow that same model. So if you're familiar with the way the Azure SDKs are managed, we should end up being very similar to the way that they're doing it. So these are the high-level items, and there are some smaller items where we are doing little bits of alignment on, but these are the major pieces. Now let's talk about areas where we aren't going to align, or maybe won't align. And this is one big piece that we have built into the Graph SDKs, where we take quite a different approach. Both the Graph SDKs and the Azure SDKs use a middleware pipeline for providing cross-cutting concerns. However, we made a very explicit decision to use the native pipeline of whatever was the native library we chose to use. So for example, in .NET, obviously it's the system.net.http client. In Java, we use, and Android, we use OK HTTP, and so on and so forth. And what the reason why we use the native pipeline was because we had customers who were very much in brownfield scenarios. They had an existing app. They currently were not using the SDK. They currently are using the native library throughout their entire application. And yet they wanted the benefits of our retry handling, our redirect handling, compression stuff, those pieces of middleware that we built, the auth providers. And what we were able to provide to customers is a client factory that just simply allowed them to change one line of code in their application where they create that HTTP client. We would pre-build an HTTP client with the middleware pipeline in place, and magically everywhere within their application where they're making calls, the middleware pipeline would transparently start adding the value of the SDK. And then they had the option over time to incrementally add the strongly typed capabilities of our request builders and model libraries that come with the rest of the SDK. Now, from a philosophical point, the Azure SDKs took a different approach where they have built a middleware pipeline, but in order to keep that middleware pipeline consistent across languages, they've designed their own custom pipeline that sits in front of that HTTP library. We don't want to do that because we think it breaks brownfield scenarios, and we are working with the Azure SDK team to try and see if there's a compromise. The Azure SDK team already have the capability of taking their custom pipeline and actually inserting it into a piece of pipeline that exists inside the native library. So there are workarounds, but this is an area where this is a capability we're not going to lose. And maybe we can work and find something that works for both Graph and Azure SDKs here. The key thing is those people who've invested in using our SDKs whilst keeping the custom library, don't worry, you will still be able to continue doing that. This is more of an engineering thing. The Azure SDKs, because they have different distributions for many services, they have a mono repo per language, and that contains both their core libraries and their generated code in a single repo. And there was a request that, can we not just have all of the code for all the SDKs in one place? We have a goal of trying to update our generated code on a weekly basis. So we basically want to completely automate that process, except for a certain amount of review in the PRs that come in. And therefore, we think it's important for us to keep our core code that's written by hand separated from our generated code. So this is another area where we are going to stay different. And finally, the big topic really is versioning. Graph takes a very different approach to versioning than the way Azure does, and for a variety of different reasons that are valid in both cases. Azure is so much more focused on deployment type scenarios, provisioning type scenarios, and it has its ARM deployment templates as a way of doing idempotent updates. And they have taken an approach that requires people to be very strict about changes, and therefore even adding an optional field in many cases requires a version change. Graph has a much more evolutionary approach to versioning, and this is why we have a different way that we release packages. We have one package for all services, but then a separate package per version, whereas SDKs have one package for all versions, but separate package per service. It's just based on the way APIs are versioned, and I don't see that aligning anytime soon just because of, well, history and scenarios that it is aimed to meet. So which brings me to the final slide, and I'm looking a little further out, medium term to long term now. I mentioned that our code generator tool is using Viper, which is a fairly old tool that uses T4 templates for generating and doesn't really have a whole lot of engineering support around that. So it's always a little scary when we have to go in and make changes. We would like to align on using Autorest as our code generation tool. That is the company tool for generating code in SDKs, and it makes the most sense for us to use that. What Autorest currently can't do is it currently doesn't generate Fluent APIs. The Azure team have done some experimentation around Fluent APIs. Specifically, they do a Fluent API for Java, which I think is largely handcrafted. They did do some experimentation for Fluent in .NET, but the community were not big fans of it. And I think it's partly due to the way that the URIs are created and designed in Azure. Every Azure service starts with subscription and then resource group and then resource provider and then actually gets into the meat. If you're having to do that navigation in every Fluent API, it just kind of feels pointless. So the Graph API design is just quite different and is more amenable to the Fluent style. And we have, as we move into the next topic, we've got a lot of community feedback that people like the Fluent API that exists in Graph. So one of the reasons there's no auto generation of a Fluent API in Autorest is because it was originally built around OpenAPI v2 that had no way of describing what we call navigation properties in CSDL, which is a way of, it's like, you know how you can go from a user to the user's manager? Well, that's a navigation property, and there was no way of describing that in OpenAPI v2. OpenAPI v3 can describe those navigation properties with a concept it has called links, and we need to work on our generation of our OpenAPI description to bring in links that describe the navigation properties. And then we need Autorest to support that concept of links. This is where we're hoping to encourage the Autorest team to go. And if we can get them to add support in Autorest for links, then we will be in a position to actually start generating Fluent APIs from Autorest. And that has the potential of bringing us a bunch of other value and engineering support in the future. And with that, I will pause and see if we have any other questions.
So there was a question around the Exchange online management APIs. It's not quite relevant to the discussion we're having today, but one thing I did want to bring up is on the user voice, often if you're asking about like, are things coming, our PMs are chased by our team across the different parts of Microsoft to ensure that they're keeping those requests up to date. And so for instance, with the Exchange online management APIs, there is a user voice ask there with about 70 votes. If you haven't voted there, I'd really encourage you to go vote on the things because it does influence our ability to encourage those teams to get those things added to their backlogs and plan for their next semester of work. In the instance with user voice, what it will do is if you've logged in to user voice and voted, when the status of those user voice requests actually change, you'll be notified by email of them. And so that's the best way for us to communicate at scale as things get added to being in review of a planning cycle or are actually put into the backlog or arrive inside of, or sorry, they're in progress or they arrive inside of the beta endpoint. So please, if that's something that's of interest of you, please go and check that out on User Voice and vote that up and you'll be subscribed. So Andy Lynch asked a question, which is, what is being done to increase the stability of the underlying services which the SDKs access? We've encountered a number of issues around service stability. Andy, let's park that till the end, and if we don't get time, please reach out to me. I'd like to understand what those service issues are. I think it'd probably be easier to take it offline because it'd be very specific to your particular scenario. In general, we do communicate any service outages on the Graph through the Graph blog on graph.microsoft.com. But Andy, you can actually probably start a thread with me offline and we can discuss there. So as there are no other questions, do you want to jump straight into the Fluent JS stuff, which I think you're going to switch gears a bit, right?
Yeah, no more slides here. So let me end this.
Oh, and Paul has one more. So as an SDK consumer, I just create a Graph service client passing an Azure credential object in. Would that be how it works?
Yep, a token credential. And stay tuned. We'll be producing some samples soon that show you how this is going to work. But it's good for us to get some feedback from community insofar as, yeah, okay, as long as it doesn't do this and do that, I'm fine with it. Or no, absolutely, this is going to cause all these kind of problems, and I have experience with the way Azure works, and it's not going to work this way for Graph. Like if people have that kind of feedback, that's just would be wonderful for us. So we just want to make sure that we're heading down a path that the community feel is going to be beneficial to them. We think it is, but sometimes we're wrong. Never. Okay, so moving on. This is, again, about alignment. We've got different teams overlapping in effort, and that's not good. Let's figure out how we can solve this problem. We have the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK, and the JavaScript SDK has a core library, but it does not have a Fluent API, and there's actually a user voice where people are requesting a Fluent. So if you feel that we definitely should have a Fluent API, please go add a vote there. Even though we are planning to do it anyway, having that extra vote helps us justify the work that we're doing to our management, because they like to know that we're doing the things that we're supposed to be doing. On the other hand, we also have the PNPJS team project, which comes from the PNB, and I know a lot of folks in the Graph community have come from the SharePoint world, and the SharePoint world is now turning into a bigger M365 world. And this library also does similar things. If you read the description of here, it says talking about calling Microsoft Graph REST APIs in a type-safe way. And one of the things that's always frustrated me before I actually joined Microsoft was when Microsoft produced two ways of doing things, and I didn't know why you should use one versus the other. And it's just one of those kind of decisions that really people shouldn't have to make. I think the value of coming from the PNP, there's a lot of other PNP infrastructure, and if you're familiar with that way of working, the PNPJS has a lot of cool integration points with the SharePoint ecosystem. And if that's where you're coming from, then maybe it makes a ton of sense to use this particular library. If you're not coming from this world, then the Graph SDK produced by the Graph SDK team, my team, we are the ones that are funded to actually build JavaScript across all of Graph. And one of the big differences in the Graph support that the PNPJS team doing, which if you go, I think if I dig into here, yeah, I'm not going to do that. In there's code for calling the Graph, and there is a Fluent API, but it's handwritten Fluent components that only cover a small surface area of the Graph, because the idea of trying to cover the entire surface area of the Graph would be extremely difficult to do, and it's something that would take a lot of community effort in order to do that. So what we are trying to do, and I presented this to the SharePoint community call the other day to try and get their feedback so that we can get on board doing the same thing. And what I did was I started to look at how does PNPJS do its Fluent API, and how potentially could we auto-generate a Fluent API that is consistent and compatible. So let's just take a quick look at a few examples. So looking at this first example, which is in PNPJS going and getting a list of contacts. So you start with a root client object and say .users, and then use get_by_ID to go and get a particular user, and then say .contacts, and it returns back a list of contacts. And this Fluent API effectively allows you to build up the request that you're making. Now, if I go back and look at our docs page for the Graph SDKs, and if I flip over to the JavaScript example here, you'll see we don't have a Fluent. You actually have to build that URI manually yourself. So you need to know, in this case, it's actually hitting whack me instead of whack users, but use your imagination. If you build a string that actually has whack users and then the email address, whack contacts, that's how you would call it in JavaScript. Whereas in C#, we actually have a Fluent API that allows you to do graph client .me .contacts .request and then get async. It's fairly similar to the way it works in the PNPJS. And if you imagine a little bit of JavaScript syntax on there instead of C#, you can squint and kind of see how it might work. So let's take a look at another example. Close this before I end up with way too many windows open. Creating something. So here is creating an invitation as a guest. And you simply do graph.invitations.create and pass in some parameters to that particular create method. If we go over to our docs page for creating an invitation, scroll down here to the actual request, you can see, here we go, in C#, you create an invitation object and then do graph client.invitations.request, add async. Not terribly different. If you look in JavaScript, it's also not that different. The only difference being is you currently have to construct the URI yourself. So if we take that fluentness over from C# and bring it into JavaScript, there's no reason why we couldn't auto-create this kind of syntax in order to prevent community having to generate this for the 1,000, I think last count, we were guessing there's around 3,000 endpoints on the beta graph API. Looking at getting an individual object, close that one and close that one. So here we do graph.teams.getById, going and retrieving an individual ID, returns back a team. If I go and look, and I'm going to just cheat a little bit here and look at getting group, because for some reason the sample for getting a team isn't rendered. I need to talk to the Teams team to find out why that is. Here we have graph client.groups, and we, in C# we're able to overload the index operator in order to go and retrieve a particular group. That might not be possible in JavaScript. It's quite reasonable for us to follow that same pattern that is used in PNPJS to use getById. Would be logical. So let's just look at a more sophisticated example now. In PNPJS, they have implemented a mechanism of batching. And you'll see here, they start off by saying, we'll create a batch, and then using a Fluent interface, they create a bunch of other requests. Go get a list of websites, and then go get the top 2, and then go and select the title. They add these all into a batch, and then they do execute on the batch. If you go look at our documentation for batches, and some people are currently going, wait, hold on, there is no documentation for batches yet. Yeah, I know, it's still in review. It'll be there very, very soon. But this is the documentation for how to do batches, and using our Fluent API to go get a request for me, and then go get a request for me.events. And then we add it into a batch content, add some batch steps to that content, and then make the request. So the whole idea here is that we believe, and you can go see these examples that are in the wiki, we believe there's really not a long leap between what the PNPJS Fluent API is doing from what we are able to generate. What is the difference is there's a core library underneath PNPJS that has a bunch of functionality that does things a little bit differently than the SDK. And we don't want to break customers that are already using that PNPJS. So what we are proposing is to work out a way that we can generate a Fluent API that can sit on top of either the PNPJS core library or sit on top of the Graph SDK. And that will provide a nice transition for people who are using already the PNPJS library. They'll be able to continue using that, or they could at any point, if they want, switch over to the Graph SDK and the JavaScript SDK. And if people are already using the JavaScript SDK, then they will be able to use that same Fluent API. And over time, we can bring those two communities together, and the code that each team are using will be the same. We'll have the same experiences. We'll be able to consistently report bugs with regards to it, and we can not waste effort duplicating more code that is unnecessary. I encourage folks to take a look at some of these examples, and if people feel strongly about particular ways that the current Fluent way works in C# and how they think it should work in JavaScript and how it works in PNPJS, please reach out, create issues on the JavaScript repo. However, find me on Twitter. I would love to hear your opinions, but this is what we want to try and do to bring these two teams together and deliver more value instead of reinventing the wheel that another team has already done. And with that, I'm going to stop talking.
So I guess the question is when will this work? Is this work started already, or is there a time period that you want to receive feedback before you kind of push the button on this?
We are in, let's call it early design phase for this. We are going to get a strong feel for how this should come together before we're going to start generating. And the thing is, once we've figured out what it looks like across the various set of scenarios, there's not a lot of code that's necessary in order to do the code gen.
Yeah.
It's about getting it right and making sure we've got solutions for all of the edge cases. And we also want to do some cleanup of the C# code generation, because at the moment it generates a little bit more than it needs to as far as classes.
Yeah.
So we're going to factor that in. I randomly picking timeframes out of the air, as I like to do.
Let's do that.
I would love to have previews of this at build.
Okay. And so then the intent would be the previews would be available for people to actually start using.
Well, previews are available all the time. I mean, it's on.
But
it's on
this
GitHub.
specific thing, the preview would have these Fluent features.
Yes.
Because I feel a lot of developers might look at these wiki pages, but until they can actually get their hands on it, they're not going to have as much.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes a lot of investment to look at a project that is in progress and actually provide feedback and understand, well, what is the team thinking? And we are really trying with our design repo to try and wear our hearts on our sleeves and put out our requirements out in the open so you can see what we're thinking. And we'll get better at that over time. But just if you have opinions, feel free to share them.
And so the message windows are very quiet. So I'd be interested, are there people already using the PNPJS to work against the Graph API? We lit up telemetry a while ago, and we saw that there was some usage of it around the Graph, but most of the PNPJS seemed to be against the SharePoint REST APIs and not the Graph. Okay, so I can see one yes here. So I'd really appreciate it if you could give feedback either in this channel or again directly in the GitHub repo where that wiki is. And then as we get closer to a preview of this at build, we can kind of move forward and get like active feedback on this via the samples and stuff you'll share.
Yeah, and if you are familiar with the PNPJS Fluent, if there's areas where you're like, there's no way they're going to be able to generate this, please, let me know. Tell me where you think there are going to be the really hard parts that maybe don't fit into a standard pattern, that maybe don't have the metadata description in CSDL to make it happen. Those are the bits that I want to know, which are going to be the painful parts.
Awesome. Okay, and then so just a quick bit of wrap up on this call. Thank you for doing that, Darrell. I think it was super useful. And the slides and this recording will be available after the session, probably by usually like Wednesday afternoon or Thursday. We also have a podcast that Paul, who was asking some of the questions in the call, I do, and we've had Kevin on Profile APIs. We had Vesa from the SharePoint engineering team on about SPFX 1.10. If you haven't listened to those, I highly go and encourage you to check those out. There are a series of other community calls as well. So if you've kind of discovered this one by being plugged into the Graph, please be aware that there's a variety of different SharePoint calls that go on around SPFX and general dev and then a SharePoint call, as well as things like Teams do one and an identity from an old specific one do as well. So I'd encourage you to go make sure that you're aware of all these calls and subscribe to the ones that are relevant to you. If you have something you'd like to present or share with the community around the Graph, please reach out to me, jthake@microsoft.com. We'd love to see more people from the community contributing and sharing on these community calls. I know that the SharePoint community calls have a lot of community engagement, and I'd really like to try and mirror that here on these calls. And so please reach out if there's anything you'd like to present. There is one person I'm talking to at the moment to try and schedule up. It would be really, really great to have a few more people that are willing to share what they're doing with the graph and so forth. And then there are a few questions crawling in. So let me just quickly read those. I heard that the PNP support for graph will end because MS wanted that. If so, when is that going to happen? So that wasn't the case. There was definitely a communication issue between the graph team, Darrel and I, and the PNPJS leaders like Patrick, Rogers, and Vesa. We didn't want it to end. We just know that strategically the direction of generating the Microsoft Graph APIs on the SDK is something that can't really be done as a hand-cranked thing because of the fact that pretty much every month there's a whole brand new workload appearing on the graph. I think we're up to about 50 different workloads now on the graph. And so we as Microsoft need to provide a JavaScript SDK, a .NET SDK, etc., that has full coverage of the graph to be able to be consumed. We don't want customers being frustrated that only certain elements of the graph are supported. We absolutely heard loud and clear that Fluent was one of the reasons that they were using PNPJS. And so we wanted to have this call, and we've been having discussions offline for a long time now to ensure that the Graph SDK for JavaScript has the same Fluent capabilities in hope that we'll kind of have the best of both worlds there. There was definitely a miscommunication, and we at no time said, don't do this. It was more of a case of this makes more sense to do it at scale through a dedicated team. And we're always going to have a Graph SDK. And so we want to make sure we provide the best experience for our developers. So apologies for any mixed messages there on that. Robert Thorne said, there was some mention of a couple of calls ago about the ability to grant API permissions more granular basis on a group basis, and this was to be discussed in a future call. Is there any news on this? So the big thing about the Graph APIs, more granular permissions, we had a call on resource-specific consent, specifically around the Teams APIs. We announced that we talked about it at Build in May of last year. We announced it at Ignite for Teams. There is still work going on there around resource-specific consent. There has been some lag there, and just to be very, very clear on the expectations of what resource-specific consent means, right now the only APIs on the graph that will support it are the Teams APIs. So the scenario that we're unlocking with the resource-specific consent is that a Teams admin or even a Teams owner can deploy a Teams app, and at that point in time can consent permissions to Teams APIs. The benefit of this from a Teams scenario is that right now to use Teams APIs, you would be required to do admin consent. And with resource-specific consent, it is not doing it for all teams. It's doing it within the scope of the team, the resource that you're consenting it against. But just a clarification is right now, it would not mean that if you could consent Planner API into that particular resource-specific consent, you'd still have to use admin consent and group rewrite all for Planner. But the envisionment over time is that resource-specific consent would be something that would incorporate all of the graph and give you that flow across teams. And that in the future, we would do the same kind of scenario for deploying an SPFX web part into SharePoint that has some kind of resource-specific consent that didn't require kind of having access to all of SharePoint. You could just have it for wherever the SharePoint SPFX thing was deployed to, the resource it was deployed to. So as we get further down, we will certainly kind of drive that. But it is unfortunately still early days as an all-up kind of all the boxes checked. And then Teams is the priority kind of scenario to test and make sure we get that right when it comes to resource-specific consent. And it's not just a Teams problem. No, this is across SharePoint, it's across Exchange. And so we're trying to work out the right way to do this so that you don't need to kind of have the kitchen sink to do something within a particular resource. So there's a lot of cross efforts going on between Identity and the Graph team and all the engineering teams underneath that. Excellent. Thank you very much for everyone attending today. Thank you, Darrell, for driving the conversation.
You're very welcome.
And let's keep this conversation going on the Twitters and in the GitHub issues that we link to in this thread. And again, the recording and the blog post will be out very, very shortly. Thanks, folks.